Bridges are important. I think we can all agree on that, especially in a river city like Pittsburgh, unless we're all going to start taking a kayak to work. Now, I'm not an engineer. I don't know how to build a bridge. I don't know about the complicated formulas and equations or what kind of steel to use, and I assume most of you here today don't know that either. But I do know about stories, because I've been telling stories for a living for most of my life. And I'll tell you this, bridges have some great stories. So what's a bridge? A bridge is when someone went to a lot of time and trouble to put a road where a road should not be. Why would they do that? What is so great about over there? So bridges are inherently a risk versus reward calculation. And that means that bridge stories are often triumphant and sometimes tragic. Here's a triumphant phase of a bridge story. This is Riccardo Morandi. He's showing the design of his brand new, super innovative, modern bridge to the president of Italy. And everyone called Riccardo Morandi a genius, and that bridge was called the Brooklyn Bridge of Italy. Now the tragedy. 43 people died this summer when the Morandi Bridge collapsed. And the scary part is, it's not that uncommon. This was the 6th fatal bridge collapse of 2018. We've already had 2 more since then. Ever since we started building bridges, we've understood this risk. In fact, if you think about it, we teach our children about it. We teach them to sing, "London Bridge is falling down." What is that? We don't teach our children to sing about plane crashes. A bridge disaster is more like a horror movie than it is a playground game. Look, I'll tell you a story about a bridge tragedy that sounds like Stephen King could have scripted it. So it takes place in 1845 in this tiny little seaside town in England called Yarmouth. And the circus is coming to town. And to promote it, they send a clown down the river in a little wash tub towed by 4 geese. And so all the children of the town of Yarmouth go running down to the riverside. This, by the way, was a time before smartphones. So all the children actually stand up off of their couches and run outdoors down to the river in order to look at this clown floating by with his geese. And they run out onto the town's brand new bridge and they break it. 79 people drown in the river that day, most of them children. And yet, in 1845, that same year, when a clown and some geese could cause a major bridge catastrophe, here in Pittsburgh, a revolutionary new bridge was built that would change the world. And naturally, here in Pittsburgh, because, as we say, Pittsburgh is the city of bridges. Pittsburgh has more bridges than any other city in the entire world. Except, no, it doesn't. That's not true. Not even close. Pittsburgh has 446 bridges. New York City has 801 bridges. So, there's silence in the room, and I'm very sorry for spoiling a very cherished Pittsburgh myth. But we should cheer up as Pittsburghers because we're still deserving of the title, City of Bridges. And that's because, in no small part, that 1845 bridge, the revolutionary one built here, because New York can have more bridges, but they wouldn't have their crown jewel bridge, the most famous bridge in the world, the Brooklyn Bridge, if it hadn't been for this bridge that was built here in Pittsburgh in 1845. It was the first bridge built by John Roebling. Now, who's John Roebling? Well, he was a promising German engineer, but he was kind of tense, and he got very frustrated with the bureaucracy at work that was holding him back, and eventually said, "The heck with it," and he quit his job, and he sold everything, and he got on a boat, and he sailed to America and said, "I'm starting all over as a farmer, forget it." And so he bought some land north of Pittsburgh, and he founded a town, named it Saxonburg, and he met a nice young German girl, and they got married, and he started a family, and he started farming as a frontier farmer in 1831 here. One small problem, though. John Roebling was a good engineer, but he was a crummy farmer. Not good at farming, so eventually he got very bored, and he decided to go back to his old vocation. He became a surveyor for the Pennsylvania Canal. Now, before there were railroads, the way that you moved big freight cargo and passengers across the country was with canal boats, not little pleasure crafts now. We're talking about boats that are bigger than a tractor trailer, huge boats, and they would be towed down man-made canals by a mule. And it worked pretty well until they got to the mountains. Now, at Altoona, at the Allegheny Mountains, they would take the boats out of the water and put them onto an incline, and a stationary steam engine would hoist them up over the ridge and down the other side using these enormous ropes, like nothing you've ever seen before, this big around, literally a mile long, super expensive. And they had to be replaced often, too, because you can imagine they would wear out, and what would happen if that rope broke? So the surveyor on the site, John Roebling, looked at this and thought, I have a better idea. If we made those ropes out of wire instead of hemp, they would be smaller, they'd last longer, they'd be stronger. And so he got some wire, and he got his neighbors together out there at Saxonburg, and they made one of these wire ropes, and he showed it to the canal people, and they loved it. And the orders started pouring in. John Roebling was made. And then it got better because the canal had another problem, and that was that once these boats came down out of the mountains, they had to cross the river to get to Pittsburgh. And crossing over the Allegheny River, they went on an aqueduct. Now, an aqueduct is like, think about an amusement park, the log ride, right? But much, much bigger because, remember, these canal boats are full of freight and they're bigger than a tractor trailer. So the original Allegheny Aqueduct was only 15 years old, but it was already falling apart. And John Roebling proposed that instead of making a new aqueduct with wooden arches, he'd use his wire cables to hang an aqueduct across the existing stone piers of the old one. Now, this was a controversial and revolutionary idea at the time. Remember, this was an era when suspension bridges could be broken by too many kids on them. Suspension bridges were just for roads, not something as heavy as an aqueduct. But Roebling's plan won people over, and he went ahead and made it, and it worked. And just as he was opening his revolutionary aqueduct over the Allegheny River, half the city burned down. In Pittsburgh, this was the Great Fire of 1845. And if it was great for anyone, it was great for John Roebling, because the bridge that burned in that fire was a new contract for him to replace. So guess who made the second bridge here in Pittsburgh? And those two bridges that Roebling built actually made his career. And so he got a lot more jobs. He got to do more canals, more aqueducts. He got to do a railroad bridge across the Niagara Gorge and a big bridge in Cincinnati. And he got to do a third bridge in Pittsburgh. This was easily the loveliest of his three Pittsburgh bridges, all ornamental ironwork. And if you look at this illustration just from before the Civil War, you can see all three of his bridges. The Monongahela Bridge and the St. Clair or 6th Street Bridge and the Allegheny Aqueduct. This is the only place you'll see them, though, because unfortunately they're all gone. They've been gone for more than a century. The railroad replaced the canal, no more need for an aqueduct. And the other two bridges were replaced long, long ago by bigger, stronger bridges. But it doesn't matter because they proved a concept. They were prototypes. So in 1869, when John Roebling said he wanted to build the biggest suspension bridge that the world had ever seen, he brought a delegation from the twin cities of Brooklyn and Manhattan here to Pittsburgh to see his bridges. And they looked at them and they were impressed, and he got the job. But be careful what you wish for, because it killed him. So 1869, John Roebling is standing on the ferry docks in Brooklyn surveying with his son, Washington, who by then is a trained bridge engineer too, his right-hand man. He's trying to figure out where they're going to put the Brooklyn Bridge, and he's not paying attention, and a ferry boat comes up and bumps up against the pier where he's standing, and the wood smashes his foot. And so he had to have his toes amputated. And here's where this bridge story gets not only tragic but weird, because John Roebling chased away the doctors. He wouldn't have any treatment for his foot other than this. They made a special little contraption. He put his wounded foot in it and ran a continual stream of tap water over his wound because he believed that would cure it. Because John Roebling was a genius about bridges but kind of an idiot about health care. And all his life, he'd believed that water had inherent healing powers. And his children were terrified of him. If they got a cold, he would wrap them up in a wet blanket for hours at a time. That would heal them, he thought. And it just made it worse. But his children couldn't say anything to him, because the other thing about John Roebling is he beat his children frequently and ruthlessly. And not just his children, but his wife too. That's the kind of guy John Roebling was. So knowing that, maybe you don't feel quite as sad to hear that tap water does not cure a foot injury, and he got tetanus and lockjaw and he died. So now, on the site of the Brooklyn Bridge project, which hasn't even really started, we have Washington Roebling, his son. Now, he's no slouch. Washington Roebling, by this point, is 32 years old. He's a decorated veteran, combat veteran of the Civil War, a trained bridge engineer. He's traveled the world learning about bridges, and he knows about one particular technology he brings to the project, and that's caissons. Now, let me explain. The Brooklyn Bridge was going to be two huge stone towers, super tall towers with cables strung between them to hang the bridge deck from. But to build these heavy towers, they had to dig down first into the river muck to find bedrock to put them on. And so in order to do that, they used caissons, which are basically big wooden boxes they flipped upside down and dropped onto the river bottom and then pumped them full of compressed air to keep the river out. And workers would go down inside. And while they're digging, other workers are building the bridge on top of them. But as those caissons sank 30, 40 feet down into the river, the workers in them started reporting pains in their arms and legs and really terrible headaches that sometimes would make them pass out. And then some of them started dying, and nobody knew why. They called it caisson disease. Today we know what it was. It was decompression sickness. We call it the bends. They were coming out of those high-pressure caissons into the regular atmosphere too fast, and nitrogen bubbles would form in their blood. It happened to Washington and almost killed him. Washington Roebling, early in the project, got the bends caisson disease so bad that for almost the whole length of the project, he was confined to his home. He couldn't leave. He couldn't go outside. So how did he get the Brooklyn Bridge done? Well, enter Emily Roebling, Washington's wife, who every day would take the reports, read them to her husband, take his orders, bring them down to the site, talk to the workmen, talk to the supervisors there. Basically made sure the Brooklyn Bridge got built. And when it opened in 1883, it wasn't Washington at the big ceremony. Emily Roebling rode across the bridge with the President of the United States. Washington stayed home. He couldn't leave the house. So, including its designer, more than 20 people died building the Brooklyn Bridge. There was also one amazing survival story. There was a worker on the top of one of the towers who fell through a shaft 100 feet down, but instead of smacking on the stone, he landed on an empty barrel that happened to be floating inside on some water that had collected there, and he came back to this job within a couple of weeks. And there's also an amazing survivor story about the Morandi Bridge. Maybe you've heard this. A man was driving across just at the moment it collapsed. So it's basically like he drove his car off a 15-story building. But somehow, as he fell, the car got lodged in a piece of the bridge deck. You can see it right there. And he landed, not a scratch. He called the emergency workers from his car phone. They came and helped him climb out. It's amazing. So Riccardo Morandi and John Roebling, two innovative bridge designers, both of them flawed men. Of course, at least John Roebling got the bridge part right. So Italy's Brooklyn Bridge lasted 51 years. Brooklyn's Brooklyn Bridge is 135 years old and still going strong. If you walk across it, it's pretty impressive. It's 500 meters from tower to tower, 5 football fields. And for 20 years, it was the biggest bridge in the world, the biggest span, until technology marches on. And the Golden Gate Bridge is actually 1,300 meters from span to span. If you put the Brooklyn Bridge and the Golden Gate Bridge together, you could fit those spans in between the biggest bridge in the world today and still have 200 meters to spare, and that is the bridge that crosses the Akashi Strait in Japan, which is a busy shipping lane. People used to cross it by ferry boats. And then in 1955, one morning, there was a lot of fog, and 2 of the boats collided. and a ferry boat sank, and 168 people drowned. And like that clown story, sadly, most of them were school children. They were on a field trip. See, disasters aren't things that only happen to bridges. Sometimes a disaster is a reason there's a bridge in the first place. This is going to be the longest bridge in the world soon. This is the first bridge with a span of 2 kilometers. For any Americans in the audience, that's 1.25 miles. It's 4 Brooklyn bridges. This is, actually, it's 2,023 meters because it's celebrating 2023, which is the centennial of the country where it's being built in Turkey. So this bridge is going to bridge 2 continents, Asia and Europe. That's a pretty good bridge story, and it's just beginning. So, what's my takeaway for you today? The next time you cross a bridge, think about what's its story. Who decided to put a road in a place where a road shouldn't be? If you think about it, it's probably older than you, and barring a tragedy, it'll probably outlast you too. But don't worry about it. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it.